Welcome to this explainer. It's pretty wild to think about, but have you ever stopped to wonder why our education system looks exactly the way it does today? Well, we are about to take a seriously fascinating journey to trace the historical legal foundations of education. We're going all the way back to primitive survival tactics in the ancient world, right up through the medieval moral frameworks. As you'll see, human dames have always had this desperate, driving need to learn, and the ways we've satisfied that need, they've radically evolved over time, literally shaping the legal and social institutions that we completely rely on today.
So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the dawn of early education, check out the great Greek philosophers, look at Roman practicality and oratory, dive into faith and medieval learning, and finish up with the rise of humanism.
Let's jump right in with Section 1, the dawn of early education. Okay, so back in the day, primitive learning was quite literally about survival. We're not talking about classrooms here, we're talking about the wild. Taught by family or tribal elders, learning happened mostly through unconscious imitation. Observation, trial, and a whole lot of error. The main goal was simply to guide individuals to become useful members of their tribe. It was all about satisfying those absolute basic needs: food, shelter, and security. Education basically meant conforming to social norms just to keep the tribe safe from the brutal forces of nature. Now, as things evolved, early civilizations like the Hindus actually systematized all this learning. Starting during the Vedic period, education was entirely dictated by the caste system. So your birth completely decided your educational destiny. Higher classes got to learn sacred texts like the Vedas and temples, while the lower classes, they were given informal training in manual labor. This rigid social pyramid acted as a very early legal framework that determined exactly who had the right to learn what. As these societies kept growing, educational needs shifted, and they began laying down some of our earliest legal and civil precedents. For example, the Chinese mandated this highly standardized system of written characters to legally select and train people for public service, putting a huge emphasis on ethical teachings. Over in the Nile River Valley, Egyptians used hieroglyphics on papyrus to teach literacy, but exclusively to the upper classes. Meanwhile, ancient Jewish education established some of the very first legal precedents for compulsory schooling. They focused heavily on familial religious instruction, passing down sacred laws, and centering their entire curriculum on monotheism.
Which brings us to Section 2, the great Greek philosophers.
Over in Greece, totalitarian city-states like Athens and Sparta sparked a massive trend of radical, logical thinking. Socrates comes onto the scene and fundamentally shapes Western philosophy with this concept of gnothi-seoton, or know thyself. He believed, straight up, that enlightenment equaled virtue. And to teach this, he used two really distinct methods. First, his notoriously destructive ironic method, basically posing unanswerable questions to force students to critically examine and contradict their own deeply held, flawed opinions. Then, he'd follow that up with the constructive maieutic method, deploying even more questions to lead the student to naturally conceive the correct idea all on their own. This gets built upon further by his student, Plato. Plato devised this incredibly rigid, age-based curriculum, and honestly, it looks surprisingly similar to the tiered, state-mandated schooling systems we use today. From birth to 7, children learn morals through play. From 7 to 16, they get humanistic training, like literature and music. From 16 to 20, the focus completely shifts to rigorous military and physical discipline. And finally, from 35 to 50, after getting intensive philosophical training, the most capable individuals enter legally mandated public service as administrators. But then Aristotle comes along, and he completely denied his predecessor's ideas that merely knowing was enough. He argued instead that virtue is brought about by actually doing. He introduced the concept of summum bonum, believing man must use reason to attain his ultimate end, which is the supreme good. Aristotle's methods were rooted deeply in observation and actual experience rather than just abstract thought. And that focus, it makes him the absolute father of modern sciences. Moving right along to Section 3, Roman practicality and oratory. So during the Roman era, the philosophical musings of the Greeks were replaced by a really intensely practical approach. The Romans judged absolutely everything by its serviceability and effectiveness to the state. Their entire educational system was aimed at molding students into the vir bonus, the good citizen, the soldier, the worker. To be an ideal educated man in Rome meant being an orator. You had to have perfectly mastered history, law, and rhetoric, specifically to serve the legal mechanisms of the state and persuade the public.
But, it wasn't all just strict civic discipline. Way before modern psychology was a thing, a highly influential Roman thinker and teacher named Quintilian made some totally groundbreaking suggestions. He argued that group instruction, healthy competition, and notably, learning through play were vastly superior to the severe floggings with leather whips that were so common at the time. He actually advocated strongly for recognizing the individual differences in students, a real game changer. And this brings us to a massive historical pivot. The barbarians invade, the mighty Roman Empire completely collapses, and the Dark Ages begin. So, what happens to education when the state falls apart, but the human need to learn survives? Well, educational and legal authority dramatically shifts directly into the hands of the church. That takes us into Section 4, Faith and Medieval Learning. During the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church became the primary engine for education, and there is a really stark contrast between the ultimate Greek teacher and the central figure of Christianity who inspired this new era. Socrates was intensely analytical, right? He used dialectics to arouse intellectual curiosity. Jesus Christ, on the other hand, appealed directly to the heart and the conscience, seeking to quicken ethical sensibilities. His entire aim was the moral regeneration of the individual. It's honestly fascinating when you realize that highly praised modern educational concepts were actively being used thousands of years ago. Long before the philosopher John Dewey popularized the concept of learning by doing, this was already a core teaching methodology established by Jesus Christ. He adjusted lessons to the actual experiences of his students. He used concrete, everyday incidents as examples, he appealed to their imaginations through parables, and he consistently recognized their individual differences. As the medieval period progressed, faith and learning intertwined in some incredibly complex ways. While monks isolated themselves in ascetic monasteries to contemplate God and preserve ancient texts, a whole new movement called Scholasticism rose up in the cathedral schools. Led by thinkers like Anselm of Canterbury, whose motto, Credo Intelligram, or I believe in order that I may understand, totally defined the era, Scholasticism was a purely intellectual discipline. It attempted an incredibly ambitious goal, to perfectly merge ancient Greek reasoning with Christian revelation, and they did this primarily through intense debate and oral examination. And finally, we arrive at Section 5, the rise of humanism. Coming out of the medieval period and into the Renaissance, humanism placed the educational focus right back on human potential and culture. Now, humanism split into two main branches. The Italian humanists practiced individual humanism. They obsessed over harmonizing the mind and morals of the single person, stressing freedom of thought and self-expression. But up in Northern Europe, social humanism took hold. They focused on using education as a democratic tool. They believed that reforming education and making it legally available to the masses was the absolute key to combating ignorance in the lower classes. We also see this era producing some incredible forward thinkers who laid the absolute groundwork for the modern classroom. Johann Sturm, a German humanist, introduced the careful grading of instruction and the use of student monitors. Meanwhile, Juan Luis Vives was an incredibly progressive thinker for his time. He passionately advocated for broadening the curriculum, and, crucially, he championed the education of women, setting a major precedent for more inclusive educational laws down the line. So, to wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought. Are our modern schools truly modern? Or are they just echoes of the past? Think about it. Every time you take an oral exam, play an educational game, learn by doing, or move up a grade level, you aren't just doing something new. You are participating in a profound legal and historical legacy that has been thousands and thousands of years in the making. It kind of makes you wonder, what will historians thousands of years from now say about the way we learn today?